So I'm Tom Ferry with the Aspen Institute Sports and Society program, as you may know. And this panel is emphasize prevention. And it's an interesting topic. It's the 8th play in the Project Play report, and is, there's a lot of discussion when we first put this thing together, because so much of the physical activity movement is about getting kids moving. But then what happens, how do we deal with the safety question? Because there's a big conversation in this country about concussions and overuse injuries and otherwise. So should this be part of the report about getting kids moving? And ultimately we decided that it does belong in this report, because there are enough parents now who are concerned about concussions and injuries that it's becoming a drag on participation. So participation would be sort of the North Star, the guiding concept of what holds Project Play together. So therefore, we believe there's a real conversation that needs to be had around how to have fewer kids hurt in sports and give parents the confidence to to sign their kids up for the array of the sports. And so to lead that panel, really honored to have Mark Hyman with us. Mark and I, I was just talking to Patrick Stigman from ESPN back there. He says, "No, is there like a publication that covers this?" I'm like, "Well, youth sports." I'm like, "Well, it's like been me and Mark and one or two other people who've really shown a passion for these issues and have followed them over time, but there hasn't been sort of a dedicated resource around this." But Mark and I have been kind of on this path for a while now. He's written several books, including one on concussions with Bob Cantu out of Boston. And Mark knows this topic and it's a very complicated topic, super well. So we're real excited to have Mark lead this conversation with you. So Mark, you want to come up?
Thank you for that very generous introduction, Tom. Well, I teach at GW. I thought I had given the last final exam of the semester, but apparently not, because we're going to begin by asking the audience to take a poll and kind of get the conversation started. So here is the question that we're going to be asking you to respond to. What grade do you give stakeholders in preventing brain and other sports injuries in children? You may have to refresh your browser in order to participate. The link is on the monitors, so we're going to give you several minutes to do that. And while you're doing that, I'm going to introduce a really powerhouse panel, an exceptional panel of experts on this subject, beginning with Dr. Kevin Bieniek, a research fellow at the Mayo Clinic and the lead author of a really important study in 2015 on chronic traumatic encephalopathy in youth football and amateur athletics. Kevin, welcome. And next, I'd like to introduce Kate Carr, the president and CEO of Safe Kids Worldwide, which is a Washington-based nonprofit that's focused on reducing preventable injury in sports and in other contexts. And Kate will be talking, among other things, about a 2014 poll conducted by Safe Kids about safety in sports that is really fascinating, and I think gives us great insight into where parents and coaches and youth athletes are with respect to this issue. Next, Dr. Sam Gandy, director of the Center for Cognitive Health at Mount Sinai Hospital, and a leading researcher in developing something that's critically important in this field, a test for CTE in living patients. And Dr. Gandy is on the cutting edge of the science in this area, and we'll be talking about that. Next, my GW colleague, Dr. Gerard Gioia, the division chief of neuropsychology at Children's National Health System at GW, the team neuropsychologist for the Washington Caps, Baltimore Ravens. Jerry is also on the medical advisory board for USA Football. And finally, Dr. Bennet Omalu, the chief medical examiner at San Joaquin County, California, professor at the University of California at Davis, and the man to see if you need Will Smith's cell phone number. Welcome. Okay, poll results. Do we have those? Very interesting. Well, let's begin by asking the panel for their reaction. How are we doing with respect to preventing injury in youth sports? Let's begin with you, Kevin.
I think I would give it a C as well. I think part of preventing brain injuries is understanding brain injuries. And I think to that extent, there's been a lot of great advocacy in this area, both in traumatic brain injuries and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. Thanks to the efforts of Dr. Omalu and others, the public is aware of CTE, neurologists are recognizing CTE, and neuropathologists are recognizing CTE as well. A study last year looked from 1954 to 2013, and it found that in the medical literature there were 149 cases of pathologically confirmed CTE. Now, within the last 3 years, there have been 129 cases of pathologically confirmed CTE. So within the span of about 3 years, we've collected as many cases as we have in the past 60 years. And people are also donating their brains more too. I just spoke to Chris Nowitzki of the Concussion Legacy Foundation today. And he said that within the past 2 years, they've had over 1,000 individuals pledge their brains for donation to science, and they're getting about 70 more athletes a month. So these are really important because the more cases that we get, the higher the statistical power that we have, and then the higher quality and the more meaningful results we can have that will help shape our reform of youth sports.
Kate, what would parents and coaches, do you think,
You know,
say?
if you focus on the question and focus on prevention as opposed to knowledge, as opposed to recognition, as opposed to treatment, I would say on prevention we're not doing so good. And I think parents are very worried, and that's why some parents are keeping their kids out of sports, because they fear they simply can't prevent it. Now, we've seen changes in certain sports in play that can limit concussions, and we certainly know we have return to play, return to school laws that talk about after the injury. But when it comes to the prevention efforts, I don't think we're quite there yet, and we're certainly not where we need to be in the long term.
So better on the management side than the prevention
I think that's
side.
a fair statement.
Okay.
And awareness.
Dr. Gandy.
I think the challenge really is to try and find a proportional response. And I think that developing a way to diagnose the disease during life so that we can get accurate numbers on incidence and prevalence so that people can get reliable, informed consent, I think is the next milestone. And I think we're well on the way. The brain imaging has really taken off in the last 20 years. A lot of what we're doing in CTE is sort of taken a page out of the book of what's been done for Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. And these companies and academia have embraced this as a challenge to develop ligands, ways of scanning the brain and visualizing the pathology of CTE.
And we'll talk a little bit later about the importance of diagnosing CTE in living patients and how that might change the management of living patients and their futures in sport. Dr. Gioia.
Well, I'm going to go somewhat timeline here on us, which is that I'd say 10 to 15 years ago, I would have rated prevention probably a D-, given it a grade of D-. I would say in 2016, we could probably give it in the C range, where the awareness has, I think, set the scene for our sporting bodies to know that they need to do something about it, about preventing this problem. And we're seeing some gains in those areas in certain ways, but we still have a ways to go.
Dr. Omalu.
Well, you know, I'm a forensic pathologist. It's something I'm saying that is actually not encouraging me so much, what I call conformational thinking. people being afraid to give up things of the past, embrace the things of the future. We as a society, we are evolving. And as we evolve, we become more intelligent. And as we become more intelligent, we give up less intelligent ways of the past. And we shouldn't be afraid to accept the truth, because there could be only one truth. And the truth is that there is nothing safe about repeated blows of the head in whatever human activity. The truth is that the brain is a post-mitotic organ. The brain does not have any ability to heal itself. Once you've suffered a concussion, the injury has already occurred. So you cannot prevent a concussion once it has occurred. But I hear in the press that we could make football safe, we could make boxing safe, we could make other high-impact contact sports safe. But the question I ask is, how would you make football safe?
Wait a minute, I'm asking the question.
No, that's
Yeah, we're going to get there.
That's why I think we haven't done a good job. We have to start first with the scientific truth and then build upon the truth. But when we continue to deny the basic fundamental truth of science and of faith, we would never get to any solution. We need to educate ourselves that, look, when you engage in high-impact contact sports, this is not about sports generally. When you're hitting your head on some other person's head with or without a helmet, it causes brain damage. That is a fundamental truth. We shouldn't play around it. And we need to be aware of that. Then we could move forward from that. I don't think we've done that.
Well, we're going to talk as much about policy as science during this panel, but I think it's important for us at the start to talk about concussions and CTE and draw a distinction between the two, because they're quite different and sometimes get conflated in the minds of parents and coaches. So, Dr. Gioia, talk to us about concussion. Are children more vulnerable to concussion and more severe symptoms from concussion than an adult athlete might be?
Well, the answer to that, again, is going to rest in ultimately the science that we bring to that question. And our evidence at this point tells us that depending on your age and depending on whether you're a boy or a girl, your sex, may actually determine the susceptibility to the injury and then the outcome to the injury. But we really don't have the kinds of epidemiological studies to firmly answer that question. Having said that, at least in the data that we have in the work that we've done, younger children seem to have a different manifestation. Typically don't take as long to recover. That may be because of mechanism, not necessarily because of brain. Adolescents seem to take a little bit longer than younger kids. And girls, when they're adolescents, seem to take longer than boys when you put them together in like kinds of sports. But again, those are our preliminary understandings. What we really need are some very good longitudinal studies to understand that. But again, if we get to that question of prevention and what is it that may produce the injury, we're going to have to build a good understanding of that as well. I think we can logically say, though, that we certainly want to protect young kids' brains. Actually, we want to protect brains at all levels, of course, but particularly younger kids who may not be as able to defend themselves from a blow.
Dr. Bieniek, talk to us about kids and CTE and the extent to which parents and coaches and others should be concerned about the possibility that kids as young as 7 or 8 playing sports might be on a path to a degenerative brain disease that could affect them for the rest of their lives.
Certainly. So within the scientific literature, there are case examples of individuals who are 17, 18 years old that play contact sports in high school, and they start exhibiting these symptoms which we associate with CTE, behavioral changes, and ultimately, tragically, some of these individuals end up committing suicide. And in these selective examples, we see that there can be CT pathology in cases as young as 17, 18 years of age. Now, in the Mayo Clinic study, this is a study that I led and we published last year, we wanted to get a sense of frequency of CT within amateur athletes. So what we did was I looked at all the male cases in our brain bank, looking for participation in contact sports in the medical records and in the obituaries. And I identified 66 individuals who had played contact sports. And with the exception of 3 of them, they'd all played at an amateur level, so in high school or in college. And of those 66 cases, 21 of them, or roughly a third, had pathology in the brains that was consistent with CTE. And in comparison, we looked at 198 controls. So these were cases that were similar to these former athletes in all regards, with the exception of having played contact sports. And of these roughly 200 controls, none of them had CTE pathology. So I think that's very telling as far as a frequency of 32% in amateur athletes. It's not as high as the 80-90% frequency we're seeing in some cohorts of professional athletes, but amateur athletes are not necessarily immune to CTE pathology as well.
Dr. Omalu, how do we interpret results like that?
You know, when I was trying to figure out the name to give to CTE in 2002, I did quite an extensive literature review dating as far back as to the time of Hippocrates. And what I established was that exposure to blunt force trauma of the head in whatever human activity, in or outside sports, has an inherent risk of causing permanent brain damage. We actually even have it more with motor vehicular accidents, with assaults. Now, in the past 3-5 years, there have been papers that have come out from Brown University, from Purdue University, and from some Canadian universities that have shown, even from Boston University, that the younger you are when you begin exposure to repeated blows of the head, the greater the risk of permanent damage. And because it's a progressive disease that sometimes takes 40 years to fully manifest, if you do a cross-sectional sample of younger amateur players when they die, the positivity rate will be lower. But as they get older, the positivity rate increases. And another thing we need to look at, we use tau as an index for the diagnosis of CTE. But there are other pathological processes, like loss of myelin, like chronic inflammatory changes in the brain. So knowing what we know now, sincerely, in high-impact contact sports, the human head is exposed to repeated blunt force trauma that would cause subconcussive injuries and concussive injuries. Personally, from what I have seen, even done over 12,000 autopsies, there is no scientific justification for children to engage in high-impact contact sports. In 1957, the American Academy of Pediatrics published a position paper in 1957 that any child under the age of 12 should not play American football. In 2011, the American Academy of Pediatrics published another paper that strongly recommended that children should not be allowed to engage in boxing. And that is where I stand, and this is a fundamental truth. In fact, as a forensic pathologist again, when some people tell me, oh, we need more epidemiological studies, there are some very basic, generally accepted principles of medicine you don't need to test. It's like to test if a gun will damage your brain if you shoot yourself. That's a fundamental truth. And a fundamental truth, too, when it comes to neuroscience, repeated blunt force trauma of the head causes brain damage, no matter what your age is.
Okay, we're coming back to that. Dr. Gandy, could you're on the front lines of this effort to diagnose CTE in living patients. With respect to children, why is this important? How would it directly affect our management of our kids' sports lives?
I think it's still early days for us to give any sort of recommendations. Our experience, though, is showing us some surprising things already. One is that we tend to classically think of this as a cognitive disorder. That's not what we're seeing clinically. Clinically, we're seeing problems with irritability and impulse control. So recognition by family and teachers I think requires the education that it's largely, or most often, a psychiatric sort of presentation rather than a cognitive one. But the changes that we're getting to see, assuming that our results are validated, are in individuals who are fairly mildly affected. So the question arises, and I'm not judging, I'm just presenting the question, is that if it's possible to visualize pathological changes during life with brain scans in kids or people of all ages who are only mildly affected but are continuing to be exposed, do we have an obligation to at least inform them that we are beginning to see the pathology in their brains? And we seem to be close to that in adults, and I don't see why it wouldn't be possible in children as well. But we don't have those data yet. We're backing down into it.
Kate, I mentioned earlier this fascinating study that Safe Kids did in 2014, and the results they're difficult to interpret because in some ways they're conflicting, because I think parents are conflicted. Can you kind of characterize where are parents in terms of their concern about the issues that we're talking about?
I think parents might be all over the place, although the trend line is showing greater concern. And I want to emphasize one thing, because we always talk about football and maybe boxing, but at the top of the list when it comes to concussions are kids who are playing hockey, or girls who are in cheerleading, or boys who could be in cheerleading, or basketball and soccer. So it's not just something that involves football. And football seems to get a lot of focus. So in 2011, we asked parents how concerned were they about concussions, and only 20% answered in the affirmative. Now, we're asking that question again this year, 5 years later, so I don't have the data. But as I look at data that came out of the ESPN Aspen Institute study, the numbers are really high. 85% of parents are concerned about injuries, and the highest concern is concussions. So we know that the increased attention on this is causing parents to think twice in some cases. Some parents, not so much. There are still some who believe that their kids could play the sports that could result in, or contact sports that could result in injury. And there are non-believers, but that happens in any kind of preventable injury. That's been my experience in seeing that. We don't have the answers yet. I think that's why it's great to be here with people who are looking at the science, because our job is to tell parents, coaches, and kids what we do know. And so the question that you were just asked, do we tell them that we're seeing something? I would say, yes, we have an obligation to reveal that, because if we know it's on a path, yes. How we communicate it and what we communicate and what dangers we communicate are interesting questions to try and answer, because it's a little bit different than saying genetically you're predisposed to Alzheimer's disease. Here, you already have some damage that can be tracked that's causing some reaction. So there are things we need to tell parents to allow parents and their kids to make a decision, and coaches to also be informed about it.
One thing the image will give us is the natural history, because we don't know whether these structural changes are coming and going. One thing we've learned about in Alzheimer's disease is that these structures that we thought of as being hard as rocks and never turned over are actually very dynamic. The molecule that Dr. Omalu referred to, tau, that accumulates in the brain in patients with CTE, can accumulate reversibly. Hibernating animals develop tangles, tau, and then whenever they wake up, it goes away. So just understanding the natural history and whether it's potentially reversible with removal from exposure or with clinical trials, we can begin to intervene.
Well, let's forget about science now. No more science. Let's talk about policy. And you know, the title of this session, cleverly, is How Much Information Do We Need to Act? I'm paraphrasing. And in fact, many youth sport national organizations have acted and have responded. U.S. Soccer is now recommending age 12 as the time when heading should begin. USA Rugby, USA Hockey, we know, has modified the age at which it believes that body checking is appropriate. And even Pop Warner this week eliminated kickoffs at its lowest age groups. Is this enough? Are these groups responding to the information that we have, or are they too slow, and does more need to be done now? I have a feeling that there may be disagreement on this panel on this issue. Who wants to take that one?
I could start.
And I'll follow, Kevin.
Okay. I think there are definitely sources of traumatic brain injury that we've already identified in some sports like soccer. If there are more concussions heading the ball, if we eliminate heading at a younger age, you know, that's going to reduce a lot of these concussions. In other sports that are more complex, we're taking different approaches to try and reduce traumatic brain injury. There's things like heads-up football, tackling techniques. There's proposals like hit count, where you have smart helmets that measure the number of hits an individual takes, and there's a number where they're out of play afterwards. And it's hard not to come back to science, because obviously the more science we have, if you have a genetic risk factor, or if there's a premorbid psychiatric condition that might dispose you to CT pathology, those are going to be important points of emphasis that is going to help shape this reform. But ultimately, and I do agree with Dr. Omalu, there is some inherent contact of some sports that's, without fundamentally changing the sport entirely, it's going to be impossible to eliminate some of these sources of subconcussive hits.
So you can't ignore science when you're developing policy. I mean, and you shouldn't ignore science. That doesn't mean we can't act. And I think that, again, as we understand, injury to the brain, and we understand each sport, which again, I think every national governing body needs to examine what are those risks that present across all sports. And I thought Kate said it well. But we have to look at, what are the ways that we can minimize that risk, regardless of the sport. Certainly, USA football, and I know I'll disagree here with Dr. Omalu, who is vehemently against it, but I'm going to take more of a middle position to say that we absolutely have to act in ways that do not allow some of the blows and the hits that historically we did not connect with injury and downstream problems. We've got to eliminate those kinds of things by putting both proper tackling and blocking techniques in place, but also doing secondary prevention, which is not allowing a second hit to happen. We're recognizing that injury by educating coaches, by making sure that parents are aware and the athletes themselves are aware of the need to acknowledge an injury, are all very, very important kinds of things. And we've got to demonstrate, as some of the preliminary work that USA Football has done in reducing general injuries by 75 or more percent, but also concussions in both practices and in games at both the high school and the youth levels. Now, those aren't perfect programs, and they need to evolve and they need to continue to improve. But I do think that we've got to manage these things in ways that we understand, because the unintended consequences of all these things can also have some adverse effects here. So I think, again, we need to have that basis to act.
Dr. Omalu.
Well, again, I would take the middle of the road, and the middle of the road for me is that adults are free to do whatever they want. If you want to jump on a plane and skydive, you can do that as an adult. If you want to play Russian roulette, you can do that as an adult. But when it comes to children, again, I don't believe in scientificity, science for the sake of science. I believe in science that serves humanity, the humanity of science. And for me personally, my science and my faith come together, because faith and science seek one thing, the truth. science through scientific methods, faith through the tenets of faith. And by my faith and science, we are dealing with human life. We are dealing with children. It's a moral duty as a society to protect our children from all types of harm and risk. That is why today we don't let children smoke. We don't have all the answers about the risks of smoking. We don't let children drink alcohol. We don't have all the answers to the effects of alcohol to the brain, on the brain. But at least we know that cigarette smoking had some inherent risk. In spite of all the noise made about cigarette smoking, only 10% of smokers develop lung cancer. But yet, once we identify a risk in business, risk management, risk-benefit analysis, if you identify a risk to mankind, you mitigate that risk, control that risk exposure. For our children, we're not talking all about sports here. We're simply talking about the high-impact contact sports: ice hockey, football, rugby, boxing, wrestling, mixed martial arts. And my position is, knowing what we know now by my faith and science, we should not continue to intentionally expose our children to the risk of brain damage.
What you're proposing would mean the death of high school football.
No, I'm proposing, again, by my faith. The letter of Paul to the Ephesians says, you must gracefully give up the things of the past, the old self. Embrace the new self in the renewal of your mind, in the righteousness and holiness of the truth. We must not play football the way we played it 20 years ago. In fact, the way we play football today was not how we played it in 1920. So when it comes to children, remember, for adults, they can play whatever. I would support an adult to do whatever he wants to do. But for children, as an evolving society, as an intelligent society, knowing what we know today, we could come up with more brain-friendly ways our children can continue to play football. I'm not for the elimination of football. No, far from that. But I stand for intelligent football.
You would be a very controversial man in the state of Texas.
The truth, there can only be one truth. And many times the truth is inconvenient. The truth is painful, many times. But the sooner you align yourself with the truth, the better for you, because you can't fight and win against the truth. The truth will always prevail. It may take a long time coming, but the truth will prevail. So I stand by the truth, and knowing what I know today, having spent my own money traveling across the country, speaking to families of football players, knowing what I know today, I do not think we should continue to take away the lives of our children by intentionally exposing them to sports, high-impact contact sports, no matter how controversial that may be. No matter how, my son is 6 years old. I wouldn't let him play. If my son wouldn't play, why would I tell another person's son to play?
Who would like to follow that?
I think you can't argue that that would be effective. I mean, the question is how not to go too far. I mean, there are boxers who don't develop clinical dementia. So I think there eventually will identify genes that increase the risk for CTE and genes that protect from CTE. The problem is we're not going to get that information quickly. That'll be at least one generation of children from now, maybe longer than that. And the issue is really how not to go too far. And the adjustments we don't know that we're adjusting the right thing. I mean, it's hard not to say that what Dr. Omalu suggests would be effective. The question is, do we need to go that far? And I don't know.
And I don't think every parent is willing to go that far when it comes to their kids. Every coach isn't willing to go that far. And that's what we see. The change, while it could be extremely effective, I wouldn't argue with you. And I respect the decision you make about your son, and I would probably make the same decision if I had a 6-year-old son, knowing what I know. But the reality is that changing the game rapidly is likely not to happen. So what can we do in the immediate time frame right now? We can encourage the youth sports leagues to change their rules, and that's already happening. And it's at the community level where I think we see the greatest risk. It's not at the college level, it's at the community level and the high school level that kids are more likely to have concussions or to have injuries. So the other aspect is not just changing the rules, but our survey that you referred to, Mark, demonstrated that kids, because they want to be in the game, are going to play injured. They're going to hide their injury. Parents are going to, and do, push coaches to play their injured child because they want their child to perhaps get that scholarship that will get them through college, or for whatever reasons, parents exert pressure on coaches. Coaches tell us they don't have the training that they want for injury prevention or knowledge of how to deal with it. And so it's a complicated mix when it comes to youth in sports. And so we have to act, I think, with great dispatch, because far too many kids are seen in the emergency room for an injury related to sports, over 1 million every year, at a tremendous cost of over $1 billion to society. So this is not a small problem. And some of those injuries are really, if not life-ending, they can be life-threatening and life-changing. So there's a need to get every stakeholder involved in these decisions and the education process about what we know today and what we need to know for tomorrow and how fast we can get there.
I think it's time for questions. So if there are questions in the audience, there's a gentleman with his hand up.
Hi, my name is Anthony DeChico. I'm the director of soccer for AstroTurf. And 3.5 years when I left coaching, I was coaching up at the University of Vermont. When I left coaching, I didn't know nearly what I do now. But my question to you is, I never hear about fields. There's over 12,000 synthetic fields in this country. And 3.5 years ago, every field that I got involved in was built over a stone base. I don't build fields now unless they're built over a shock attenuation pad. This seems to me to be one of the easiest ways to create a consistent surface. And if I'm wrong, BU is saying now 1 in 5 concussions are the result of head to surface, or the whiplash is an effect of head to surface. So do any of you endorse pads for synthetic fields, or further testing, maybe a shift from the GMAX criteria to the HIC criteria? Thoughts on any of that?
So, I think more broadly stated, and I won't get into the specifics there, clearly, one way of preventing this is to diminish the forces, and the field may play a role. We know that people seek the ultimate helmet to play a role. All of those will play a role. But again, we've got to understand in what ways they may play a role or not. When you have a whipping head hit any kind of surface, whether it's got a little bit of padding or a lot of bit of padding, you're still going to have that brain move. So it won't be the single answer, obviously. And again, I think that there have to be multiple solutions that look at the prevention issue here. One of them could be the diminution of that force that's transmitted to the head.
It's basically a clinical trial.
Yeah.
Or an engineering study.
Well, that's part of that study, yeah.
Oh, good, I get to ask another one.
Yep, get one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I read recently about, I think it's called the Zenith helmet, football helmet, or one of these new helmets that is out. Is that promising, some of this technology for what Dr. Omalu was talking about as brain-friendly sports or brain-friendly football?
Well, again, it's part of that truth I'm talking about, the truth. Because you hear marketing positioning in the press, a helmet manufacturer will misinform parents that this is the solution to your child's concussions and subconcussions, that this is a high technology In fact, one of the companies approached me to endorse their product. The truth is that with or without a helmet, no matter how expensive it could be, your brain will still bounce around your skull with every impact. In fact, looking at it critically, the humanity of the science, when you wear a helmet, it gives you a false sense of protection. You're more likely to hit with your head. And even very basic physics, those helmets are heavy. When you increase the mass of your head, it increases the momentum of the impact. It increases the dimension of your head. Therefore, it's generating more energy, counterintuitively, that will be downloaded to your brain. It's again getting down to the truth, the humanity of the science, the truth. We need to let parents know that, look, with or without a helmet, your child still has a risk of suffering permanent brain damage. But I don't hear anybody talk about it. In fact, going back to the truth, I was in San Francisco during last year's Super Bowl, or this year's Super Bowl. And the commissioner of the NFL wasn't embracing CTE. Even the chief medical officer of the NFL said there is no scientific evidence that football causes brain damage. Again, we need to stop all that. By my faith and science, let us begin with the truth to liberate all of us, to enlighten us. The more you embrace and hold on to the truth, the greater the likelihood that you will find a solution. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Sobering, but...
Yeah, so the science too, the biomechanical science to go along with that response is that helmets at this point are at best maybe a third or fourth downline even option. They are not built to diffuse a force coming this way, out that way, which is really, they need to take the force and literally skirt it around the individual. They're not yet built for that.
There are also athletes with pathological CTE who never had a recorded concussion. So you don't necessarily have to have the concussion to have the CTE pathology.
And that is what, again, thank you for reminding me.
Jostling in the head is...
We all hear about concussions, concussions, concussions. No, the problem is not concussions. The problem is with every impact of your head. So take an example, Dr. Talavad's study, which came out about 4 years ago. Beautiful study. They looked at high school students that did not have any complaint, that did not have any concussion, but they played football for 1 season. And then they looked at them several months later and documented radiological evidence of brain damage after just 1 season. But you turn on the news, nobody talks about that. All they talk about is concussions, concussions. No, it's not concussions. It's with every play, every impact on your head. Thank you for bringing that up.
Although, again, I'm going to moderate this a little bit. You know, so that Talavage found those findings. We don't entirely understand what those findings mean in terms of damage versus change, whether they're permanent, whether they actually modify over time. I mean, I think we need good longitudinal studies to understand that. So 1 point in time is a start, but then we need to understand how that progresses or not. You know, so I mean, I think there are still some pretty unanswered questions around those findings.
But in response to what you said, really, again, when you look at science critically, you will never have all the answers to the questions in science. In fact, the more you discover, the more you realize what you do not know. And it continues. We will never have all the answers for Alzheimer's disease. We'll never have all the answers for CTE. We'll never even have all the answers for malaria. But we shouldn't wait till we have all the answers to act. That is the point I'm making.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Dr. Hodge from the University of Miami. I run the concussion program in Miami. We don't have the science yet in youth sports. There is something coming out now. You've looked at some of the adult literature, especially Boston, the brain autopsy studies with CTE. But let's take it back to the kids, okay? You take all these contact sports away from the millions of children that play sports in this country. let's talk about the positives that outweigh the negatives and the smaller number of kids that really do get concussions in the youth sport ages. I'd like to ask the panel about all the positives that are outweighing the negatives in the smaller number of children that we have seen in epidemiological studies, because we haven't seen any scientific yet studies with longitudinal studies with kids.
What about the benefits of youth sports, and particularly collision sports? Aren't there benefits, and can they be replicated in sports other than those sports, or can those sports be modified in ways that preserve the sport but reduce or eliminate head trauma? I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's what, the question is, if you reduce frequency, if you reduce magnitude, if you, change the way that kids are contacting each other. I mean, those are the things that many of these sports are really trying to handle at this point. Now, again, and I would agree, science is not perfect. We will never have the perfect answer, but we can at least lead ourselves toward a better solution. I do think that reducing exposure is a very important thing. The National Federation of State High School Associations has put out recommendations for what they believe to be a reasonable degree of any kind of contact. We've seen that with those reductions, there have been some improvements in health and safety. Certainly, I think one of the studies is trying to reteach that respect for the head. Eric Swartz's study in New Hampshire looking at teach people that this is not meant to be a weapon, that the helmet is not actually meant to gladiator you, it is meant to actually protect you, but maintain that respect. I think all those kinds of factors together, reduce the risk, and then the benefits of teamwork through obviously a tough sport, be it hockey, soccer, lacrosse, football. I think for many kids, results in substantial character development. But again, not in the presence of football as it has been, really in football as it needs to be.
I'd like to add to that, if I can. I mean, here we sit at Project Play, whose very mission is to engage more kids in sports and to look at the variety of tactics that we can employ to do that. And it's vitally important that we do it. And so we should not be thinking about ways that we deprive kids, more kids, of the opportunity to engage in sports, a variety of them. And in fact, they should play a variety. We talked about sports specialization early today. But in the process of doing that, we can educate kids, parents, coaches, policymakers, stakeholders about ways to protect kids from injuries while they're playing sports. And that's the prevention part of this. So to your point, I'm sure you'd like to see fewer kids coming in with concussions or with some type of injury or any kind of injury. How do we achieve that mutual goal? Keep them playing while protecting them so they do have the myriad of benefits of playing sports, which are tremendous for our kids.
And also educate the kids.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Dr. Omalu.
Like I had said earlier, we as a society, we evolve. And as we evolve, we change. This is not against participation of youths in sports. There are other less contact, less impact sports. So many of them. And then when it comes to the risk-benefit analysis of high-impact contact sports, this is specifically high-impact contact sports, you ask yourself, which is more important? Your brain or some transient entertainment or physical activity as a child? Which is more important to you? Should I now engage in other types of sports like track and field, like volleyball, like table tennis, so that I preserve my naturally given intellectual capacity? Or do I intentionally compromise that by engaging in activities that damage my brain? This is not anti-sport. In fact, this is for more intelligent sport. We are changing as a society. And as we're changing, let us embrace more progressive ways to protect ourselves and protect our society. Let me give you another example. I went to Camp Pendleton. The highest suicide rate in the military is among the special forces. Guess what is unique about the Special Forces? They are the single group that are most exposed to ordinances in training. And I said to the military, hey, all it takes is a slight change in behavior. Expose them less to ordinances and training so that you turn out more intelligent and smarter soldiers. Because if you expose them to ordinances and damage their brain, ultimately you're turning out less intelligent soldiers. It's not going to undermine our military, rather it's going to make our military smarter. So again, this is about faith and science. Faith says we must change. Science says we evolve. As a society, we're moving forward. We don't have to do things in the 21st century like we did them in the 20th century. Does that make sense?
I mean, a question is how to put a number on an acceptable risk reduction.
Where's the line?
Exactly.
That's the question.
I mean, what Dr. Omalu says is the only way to bring the incidence to zero tomorrow. Otherwise, we're accepting some risk going forward. I'm not in favor of it, but I'm not arguing that this is definitely the way to go, but it's the only way to get to zero quickly.
And yet, what might those kids do otherwise that would expose them to other risks? I mean, I think, the challenge here is knowing that you've got varying kinds of things, and I would much prefer a youngster inside of a sport with good role models, with responsible teaching and coaching, with responsible rule following, that have a reduced risk than necessarily doing other things where that risk may be increased that we don't appreciate. In fact, one could argue, and as a clinician, I see concussions, whether it's an athlete or not an athlete, for many, many different reasons that life presents. I talked about somebody getting hit in the head with a shoe because somebody was angry at them. All different kinds of things happen. How do we manage those risks? And again, I think it's that cost benefit and what we get from that, because we'll never totally eliminate risk without either an unintended consequence potentially entering or really losing out on an important life experience.
Well, I don't know that we resolved anything, but it was a very spirited discussion. So I want to thank the panel for your comments and comments.
I appreciate your passion.